Hello and welcome to another episode of the English Talk community. I'm Julia, and I'm so excited to have you here with us today. Whether you're just starting your English learning journey or you've been practicing for a while, I'm confident that today's episode will give you some great insights and practical tips to help you sound more natural when speaking English. Now, I know that for many of us, speaking English can feel a little challenging. Maybe you've spent years learning grammar rules, memorizing vocabulary, and yet, when it's time to speak, it still feels like something's missing. You might feel like your English is good enough to understand others, but when it comes to speaking, something just doesn't click. It can be frustrating, right? Well, today we're going to dive into something that's incredibly important, but often overlooked in language learning: how to sound natural when speaking English. It's not just about getting the grammar right or memorizing new words. It's about making your speech flow in a way that feels comfortable and natural, like a native speaker would do. You see, sounding natural in English doesn't mean you have to speak perfectly or use complicated words all the time. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes people make when learning a new language is trying to be too perfect. They think that every sentence needs to be flawless, every word needs to be pronounced perfectly, and they get so caught up in that perfection that it actually holds them back from speaking with confidence. If that sounds familiar, don't worry. You're not alone. So what's the goal here today? We're going to talk about some simple but powerful ways you can start sounding more natural when you speak English. These aren't difficult grammar rules or new vocabulary lists that you have to memorize. No, these are practical, easy-to-apply tips that will make your English sound smoother, more relaxed, and more like the way native speakers communicate. Now, before we get into the tips, I want you to take a moment and think about your own experiences speaking English. Maybe you've been in situations where you understood everything someone was saying, but when it was your turn to speak, you felt unsure or awkward. Or maybe you've been speaking to someone and they've had trouble understanding you, even though you thought you were speaking clearly. Have you ever been there? I know I have, and I've worked with so many learners who've shared similar struggles. It's normal to feel that way, but the good news is that there's a way to overcome it. The key to sounding more natural in English lies in the way we speak, not just the words we use. Native speakers often use simpler, more relaxed structures in their speech. We use contractions, we drop certain words, and we often don't pronounce everything exactly as it's written. That's right. Sometimes the way we speak is different from the way we write. It's a lot more fluid and flexible, and if you can start adopting some of these strategies, you'll be amazed at how much more natural your English will sound. Let's break that down a little. If you've ever heard a native English speaker say something like, "I'm going to go to the store," instead of, "I am going to go to the store," or "she's going to do it later," instead of, "she is going to do it later," you've heard an example of what I'm talking about. These are contractions and informal speech patterns that native speakers use all the time. And guess what? You can use them too. It doesn't matter if you're speaking to a friend or a colleague. Using these contractions will make your speech sound more authentic and less robotic. Another example is in the way we use certain expressions. Native speakers often use phrases like "what's up" instead of "how are you?" or "you know," as a way of checking if the listener is following along. These phrases might not always make sense if you're translating them literally, but they're common in everyday conversation. And if you start incorporating these into your speech, you'll sound much more natural. But it's not just about the words you use, it's also about how you say them. Think about the rhythm of your speech. Native speakers have a certain rhythm to their language, and this rhythm is something you can learn over time. It's not about speaking fast, but about understanding where to place the emphasis in a sentence, how to use intonation to express emotion or meaning, and how to make your speech sound smooth and flowing. For example, let's take a look at this sentence. "I can't believe how amazing this concert was." If you emphasize the word amazing, the sentence sounds excited and full of enthusiasm. But if you emphasize the word believe, it sounds more reflective. The rhythm and emphasis you use can completely change the feeling of what you're saying, and it's an important part of sounding natural in English. Another point to remember is that native speakers often skip over or blend words together when speaking. This is something you might not notice right away, but when you pay attention to the way people speak, you'll start to see it more clearly. For instance, in a sentence like, "I want to go to the movies," a native speaker might say, "I want to go to the movies." It's faster and easier to say, and it sounds more natural in casual conversation. This is something that comes with time. But if you start paying attention to these small details, It will help you sound more natural as well. And let's not forget about body language and tone of voice. These are essential parts of communication that can make a huge difference in how natural you sound when speaking. Native speakers use their tone and gestures to emphasize certain points, express emotions, and keep the conversation flowing. When you speak, don't be afraid to add some expression to your voice or use gestures to help convey what you're saying. It makes a world of difference. As we go through today's episode, I'll be sharing more tips and examples on how to make your English sound more natural. But before we dive into those, I want you to think about something. What's the most natural thing about the way you speak your native language? What comes easy to you? How can you take those things and apply them to English? By understanding what feels natural for you, we can start to find ways to bring that same ease into your English conversations. So, stick with me. Today's episode is all about making you feel more comfortable and confident when speaking English. And I promise that by the end of it, you'll have some great tools to sound just like a native speaker. When we talk about learning a language, it's easy to get caught up in perfect grammar, vocabulary, and all the rules that come with it. But let's be honest, how many of us have felt a bit lost or unsure when it comes to speaking? You might know all the words, you can even write great sentences, but when it's time to speak, it's a whole different story. That's why today we're going to focus on something that can really help you feel more at ease and confident, sounding natural when you speak English. So, why? Is it so important to sound natural? Well, let's think about it. Imagine you're talking to a native English speaker. You understand everything they say, but when it's your turn to speak, you might feel a bit nervous. Maybe you're overthinking your grammar or trying to remember specific vocabulary, and as a result, your words feel stiff or forced. In moments like these, you might get frustrated, thinking that something's wrong with your English. The truth is, being able to speak naturally is what really allows you to connect with others. When you sound natural, you can focus on what you're saying rather than how you're saying it. This makes your communication more effective and enjoyable for both you and your conversation partner. So, it's not about being perfect, it's about finding a flow and sounding comfortable, like you would in your own language. When you can do that, you'll notice how much more fluid and confident your speaking becomes. But let me ask you this. Have you ever felt insecure about speaking English? Maybe you've been in a situation where you wanted to speak, but something held you back. Perhaps you were worried about making mistakes or didn't want to sound too formal or too stiff when talking. It's a common feeling, and I want to tell you right now that you're not alone. Many language learners feel exactly the same way, and it's something that's totally normal to experience. I know it can be intimidating. When you're speaking in a second language, you often feel like you need to sound perfect to be understood. But let me tell you, even native speakers don't always speak perfectly. They make mistakes, they use informal expressions, and sometimes they even skip words when they talk. It's part of being human, and it's one of the things that makes communication so interesting and dynamic. If you've ever found yourself hesitating before speaking or overthinking your words, I want you to know that it's okay. This is a challenge that many learners face. The key is not to focus on sounding perfect, but rather on sounding clear, confident, and natural. And that's exactly what we're going to focus on today. How can you sound more natural, even if you're still learning the language? How can you take what you know and use it in a way that feels relaxed, even if you're not quite there yet? So, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a conversation where you felt like you didn't sound as natural as you wanted to? Maybe you were trying to use a complicated sentence and it just didn't flow, or you felt like you weren't being understood the way you wanted. I know that feeling, and many learners have shared similar stories with me. It's important to understand that this happens to everyone, and the best way to overcome it is by learning some simple techniques to sound more natural. As we go through this episode, think about your own experiences with speaking English. Do you ever feel hesitant or unsure of how to sound more natural? Let's dive into those feelings together and start working on how you can feel more confident, more relaxed, and more like a natural English speaker. When we think about becoming fluent in any language, one thing stands out as absolutely essential: practice. You can study grammar rules, memorize vocabulary, and read as many books as you want, but none of that is going to make you fluent unless you actually put it into practice. When it comes to speaking English, especially sounding natural, it's all about regular, consistent practice. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become with the language, and the easier it will be for you to express yourself without feeling nervous or self-conscious. I want to emphasize that fluency is not something that happens overnight. It's a process, and it takes time. The key to getting better is showing up every day and putting in the effort. It doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you've been learning English for a while. If you want to sound more natural, when you speak, you have to practice. It's that simple. Think about it this way. When you were learning your first language, did you become fluent just by studying grammar? Of course not. You learned by hearing the language spoken around you, by mimicking what you heard, and by practicing it with others. This same concept applies to learning English. The more you hear English spoken and the more you use it yourself, the more natural it will become. But here's the thing. Many learners make the mistake of thinking that they need to be in an English-speaking country or have perfect conditions in order to practice. But that's not true at all. In today's world, you have so many resources available to help you practice, no matter where you are. You don't need to be surrounded by native speakers to improve your English. The power of technology means that you can listen to English being spoken anytime, anywhere. One of the best ways to practice speaking naturally is by exposing yourself to as much spoken English as possible. Listen to podcasts, watch movies and TV shows, and try to pay attention to how native speakers speak. You'll notice things like the pace of their speech, the natural rise and fall in their voices, and how they use contractions and informal expressions. This is how real communication happens. Native speakers don't use perfectly structured sentences all the time. They speak in a fluid, relaxed way that makes communication feel more personal and engaging. Now, it's easy to think that just listening isn't enough. You might think, okay, I hear it, but how do I actually use what I've learned? The answer is simple. Start speaking. It might feel intimidating at first, but the more you practice speaking English, the more natural it will feel. You don't need to have an extensive vocabulary or speak in long sentences. Start by using the simple phrases you've heard. Repeat what you've listened to. Copy the way native speakers say things. And remember, you don't have to speak perfectly right away. The important thing is to make speaking a regular part of your routine. Even if you don't have someone to practice with, you can still practice on your own. Try talking to yourself in English, narrating your day, or even practicing speaking along with a movie or TV show. This kind of self-practice is a great way to get comfortable with the sounds and rhythm of the language. The more you do it, the easier it will become to speak naturally when the time comes to have a real conversation. You might be wondering, but Julia, what if I make mistakes? And here's the thing. Making mistakes is a huge part of the learning process. In fact, the more mistakes you make, the more you learn. Native speakers make mistakes all the time, and they don't worry about it. They focus on getting their point across and continuing the conversation. So don't let the fear of making mistakes stop you from speaking. In fact, try to embrace those mistakes as learning opportunities. Each mistake is a step closer to sounding more natural. And let's not forget the power of repetition. This is one of the secrets to becoming fluent in any language. When you keep repeating the same phrases and sentences over and over again, they start to become second nature. It's like muscle memory for your brain. For example, when you first start learning a new phrase, it might feel awkward or unnatural. But after saying it a few times, you'll start saying it without even thinking about it. That's when you know you're on the right track. Now, I want to give you a little challenge. I encourage you to spend some time every day listening to spoken English and practicing speaking, even if it's just for a few minutes. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just pick something simple, like repeating a phrase you heard in a podcast, or trying to mimic the way a character in a movie speaks. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel, and you'll start to notice the difference in your confidence and fluency. One of the reasons people hesitate to speak is because they feel like they're not ready or they don't have enough vocabulary. But trust me, you don't need to know every word in the dictionary to sound natural. Native speakers don't use all the words in the dictionary either. They rely on simple phrases and expressions to communicate effectively. And as you practice, you'll start to expand your vocabulary and add more phrases to your speaking repertoire. Another great way to practice is by finding a language partner. There are so many language exchange apps and websites where you can connect with people who are learning your native language and vice versa. This way, you get to practice speaking with someone who understands what you're going through. Plus, you'll learn a lot from hearing them speak, and they can give you feedback on your speaking as well. The bottom line is this: the more you practice speaking English, the more natural you'll sound. Don't be afraid to make mistakes or to start small. Every bit of practice counts, and the more consistent you are, the better you'll get. Try to expose yourself to as much spoken English as possible, repeat what you hear, and find opportunities to speak, even if it's just with yourself at first. Little by little, you'll start to sound more and more natural, and you'll feel more confident in your ability to communicate in English. So remember, practice is key. Don't be afraid to jump in and start speaking, even if you feel unsure. With regular practice, you'll find that speaking English naturally becomes easier and easier. Keep at it, and you'll see the progress. Let me tell you a story about Maria, a student from Mexico City, who faced many of the challenges that you might be dealing with as well. Maria had been learning English for several years. She could read and understand English texts without much trouble, and her vocabulary was quite strong. But when it came to speaking, she felt stuck. Every time Maria tried to speak English, especially in conversations with native speakers or more advanced learners, she would get nervous. It wasn't that she didn't know what to say. She knew exactly what she wanted to express. The problem was that the words wouldn't come out as smoothly as she expected. She would often feel awkward and uncomfortable, as though she wasn't communicating the way she wanted to. She knew the grammar, she knew the words, but something about her speech didn't feel natural. Maria's biggest struggle was with the complexity of her sentences. She'd learned that in English, you could express yourself in so many different ways, using complex structures and more sophisticated vocabulary. At first, she was excited to try out these new, advanced phrases. However, every time she tried to use them in a conversation, she started to feel more and more uncomfortable. It was like her brain would freeze up. She would think, I need to use these more advanced structures if I want to sound fluent, but then when it came to actually speaking, the sentences would come out wrong, or they would sound awkward. For example, when talking to a friend in English, Maria would try to say something like, I have been considering the possibility of visiting a new city next month, because she thought it sounded more sophisticated. But as she said it, she noticed her friend looking a little confused. The sentence, while grammatically correct, sounded overly formal and forced. Her friend didn't say anything, but Maria could feel the disconnect. She quickly shifted the conversation to something else, feeling a little embarrassed about how she had tried to sound more advanced than she really needed to. This situation became more and more common for Maria. She would try to sound more fluent by using complicated words or complex sentence structures, thinking that this would make her sound more natural and advanced. But instead of helping her, it made her feel even more out of place. Every time she tried to use a complicated structure, she would start to overthink it, and this would just make her more nervous. She knew that in her native language, Spanish, she would never speak so formally to a friend. So, why was she trying so hard to sound like that in English? It wasn't like her at all. Maria began to realize something important. The more complicated she tried to make her sentences, the more difficult it became to express herself. Instead of sounding fluent, she sounded stiff, as though she was trying too hard. And because she was so focused on making her sentences sound perfect, she wasn't able to express herself as naturally as she would have liked. It was frustrating for her, and she started to wonder if she would ever be able to speak English with the same ease that she spoke Spanish. One day, Maria was speaking with a friend of hers who was a native English speaker. She had been practicing her English for a while and felt pretty confident in her abilities. However, just like usual, when it was her turn to speak, Maria started feeling uncomfortable. She was trying to use a new phrase she had learned in class, I had been thinking about, but when she said it out loud, it didn't sound right. Her friend paused and said, I know what you mean, but you could just say, I was thinking about it, and it would sound more natural. Maria was a bit surprised. Why had she been making things so complicated? Her friend explained that in everyday conversations, native speakers often simplify their sentences. They use more relaxed and straightforward language, even if they're discussing something important or serious. Maria's friend reminded her that English speakers don't necessarily use complex structures unless they need to. Most of the time, they prefer to communicate clearly and efficiently, rather than trying to sound sophisticated. This gave Maria a lot to think about. She realized that she had been so focused on sounding advanced that she had lost sight of what really mattered: communication. It wasn't just about using more complex phrases or worrying about grammar. It was about sounding relaxed, confident, and approachable. So Maria decided to try something different. Instead of aiming to sound more sophisticated, she would focus on simplicity. She would stop trying to use overly complicated phrases and just speak in a way that felt natural. This didn't mean abandoning all the grammar she had learned, but it meant taking a step back and focusing on being clear and direct with her speech. As she started practicing this new approach, Maria noticed a huge difference. When she simplified her sentences, she felt less pressure and more confident in her speech. She no longer worried about making her sentences sound perfect or using advanced vocabulary. Instead, she focused on being clear and making sure that the message she was trying to convey was understood. As a result, her conversations felt more comfortable, and she noticed that people were understanding her much better. For example, instead of saying, "I have been considering the possibility of going to the cinema this weekend," she simply said, "I'm thinking about going to the movies this weekend." It wasn't a complicated sentence, but it sounded natural and was easy to understand. Over time, Maria learned that it wasn't about using big words or long phrases. It was about choosing the right words that made her sound comfortable and natural, not forced. Maria's story is something that many learners of English can relate to. We all want to sound fluent and confident, and sometimes we think that using complex structures will help us get there. But in reality, it's often the simpler, more direct sentences that make our speech sound more natural and easy to understand. Maria learned that fluency doesn't mean using big words or complicated sentences. It means being able to express yourself clearly and comfortably. The more she practiced speaking simply and naturally, the more fluent and confident she became. And see, you've ever felt like Maria, trying to sound more advanced and ending up feeling awkward? You're not alone. But remember, you don't need to use complicated structures to sound fluent. You can achieve natural-sounding speech by keeping things simple and focusing on clarity. Just like Maria, you can practice speaking in a relaxed, natural way that feels comfortable and easy. With time, this will become second nature for you, and you'll feel more confident than ever when speaking English. Perfectionism is something that many of us struggle with when learning a new language, especially when it comes to speaking. We all want to be able to speak perfectly, to get every word, every sentence just right. But here's the reality. Striving for perfection can actually hold us back more than it helps. In fact, the pursuit of perfection in language learning can often be a major obstacle, and I want to explain why that is. When we're learning English, or any language for that matter, it's easy to think that if we just get everything right, we'll sound natural, we'll be fluent, and we'll impress others. We focus so much on making sure that every word is pronounced correctly, that every sentence is grammatically perfect, that we sometimes forget what really matters: communication. It's not about speaking perfectly. It's about being able to express yourself clearly and comfortably. The problem with perfectionism is that it creates a lot of unnecessary pressure. This pressure comes from within us. We feel like we need to speak without any mistakes, but mistakes are actually a normal part of the learning process. In fact, they're essential. When we make mistakes, it's not a sign of failure. It's an opportunity to learn and improve. Think about when you were a child learning to walk or ride a bike. Did you do it perfectly the first time? Of course not. You fell down, you stumbled, and you made plenty of mistakes. But each time you learned something new, and eventually you were able to walk or ride without even thinking about it. The same concept applies to language learning. When you make a mistake while speaking, it's not something to be ashamed of. Instead, it's a valuable learning experience. Every mistake is an opportunity to understand what went wrong and how to improve. Without mistakes, you would never know what areas of the language need more attention. If you always got everything right on the first try, how would you know what to work on? The truth is, mistakes help us grow. However, many learners of English, just like you, find themselves stuck in the cycle of trying to avoid mistakes. They focus so much on saying everything perfectly that they become afraid to speak at all. This fear of making mistakes can make us hesitant to try. We might find ourselves avoiding conversations, putting off practicing, or feeling frustrated when we don't speak the way we think we should. And that, my friends, is when the process of learning becomes really challenging. Here's something I want you to think about. When you're speaking in English, what is your goal? Is it to sound perfect, or is it to communicate? If your goal is to communicate, then mistakes are not something to avoid. They're a natural and helpful part of the process. Every time you make a mistake, you get closer to understanding the language better. Every time you speak, even if you make a mistake, you're building your confidence, and you're improving your ability to express yourself in English. This mindset shift is crucial. If you keep focusing on perfection, you're likely to find yourself in a constant state of frustration. You'll spend so much time trying to get things perfect that you may miss out on valuable practice. Language is meant to be used, not just studied. It's about getting out there, making mistakes, and learning from them. The more you speak, the more mistakes you'll make, and the more you'll learn. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're having a conversation with a friend in English, and you say, "I have been to the store yesterday." Now, this sentence isn't exactly correct. In English, you wouldn't use the present perfect tense, have been, with a specific time in the past like yesterday. The correct sentence would be, "I went to the store yesterday." So yes, there's a mistake. But instead of beating yourself up about it, think about this. What do you do next? Do you stop speaking and get frustrated? Or do you simply correct yourself and keep going? If you choose the latter option, you're already on the right path. Making that mistake is part of the learning process, and it's not the end of the world. In fact, now you know that you should use the simple past tense, went, when talking about something that happened at a specific time in the past. Next, time. You'll remember this, and it will become second nature. What's important here is that you didn't let the mistake stop you. You didn't let it discourage you from continuing the conversation. You used the mistake as an opportunity to learn, and that's what matters. Every time you speak, even if you make a mistake, you're making progress. You're gaining more experience, and you're getting closer to sounding natural. The key is to embrace mistakes as part of the process, not as something to be afraid of. Now let's talk about how we can overcome this fear of mistakes. One of the best ways to do this is to start speaking as much as possible. Yes, I know that might sound a little intimidating, but it's true. The more you practice speaking, the more comfortable you'll become with the idea of making mistakes. And the more comfortable you become with making mistakes, the more natural you'll sound in conversations. When you stop worrying about being perfect and start focusing on communicating, you'll notice that speaking becomes easier, and you'll start to feel more confident. Another way to overcome the fear of mistakes is to change your mindset about what it means to speak well in English. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, start seeing them as signs of progress. Each mistake is proof that you're trying, that you're putting yourself out there, and that you're actively learning. As long as you're speaking, you're improving, and that's what matters. Language isn't about perfection, it's about communication. And to communicate, you need to practice. Also, keep in mind that native speakers make mistakes too. Yes, even native speakers. They mispronounce words, mix up tenses, and sometimes don't know the exact word they want to say. But they don't worry about it. They just keep talking. And this is exactly what you should do as well. Language is a living, breathing thing. It evolves, it changes, and mistakes are just part of how it grows. So the next time you make a mistake, whether it's in a conversation or in your practice, don't get discouraged. Don't let the fear of being imperfect hold you back. Instead, see it as a sign that you're learning and growing. Embrace your mistakes, learn from them, and keep practicing. The more you do this, the more natural you'll sound, and the more confident you'll feel in your ability to speak English. The path to fluency is not about perfection, it's about practice, persistence, and patience. So keep going, mistakes and all. You're on the right track. When it comes to speaking English naturally, simplicity is often the key. Many learners make the mistake of overcomplicating their sentences, trying to sound advanced or formal, when, in reality, the most natural and effective way to communicate is by using simple, straightforward language. In this section, I want to show you some examples of simple phrases that sound much more natural in everyday conversations. These small changes can help you sound more fluent and confident without getting caught up in trying to use complex structures that might make you sound stiff or forced. Let's start with a very common phrase. How are you doing today? It's a perfectly acceptable question, but when you're trying to sound more natural in conversation, you'll often find that native speakers prefer to simply say, "How are you?" The first version, "How are you doing today?" sounds a bit more formal and a little stiff, especially in casual conversations. It's not wrong to use, but it can make the conversation feel more awkward than it needs to be. "How are you?" is much more relaxed, and it's the version that you'll hear most often in day-to-day interactions. It's short, simple, and gets straight to the point. And let's be honest, when we ask someone how they're doing, we're not really expecting a long, detailed answer. We just want to know how they're feeling and how are you. Does that job perfectly? Another example. Instead of saying, I am going to the store to buy some groceries, you could simply say, I'm going to the store. The extra detail about buying groceries is unnecessary unless it's important. To the context. Most of the time, people understand that when you say you're going to the store, you mean you're going to buy something. By cutting out the unnecessary words, you make your sentence more fluid and easy to understand. It also sounds less formal and more like something you would hear in a casual conversation. Here's a similar example. I am planning on meeting my friend at the coffee shop later today. This is another sentence that sounds a little more formal than it needs to. A much simpler way to express the same idea would be, I'm meeting my friend at the coffee shop later. The phrase I am planning on adds unnecessary complexity, and the simpler version gets the message across just as effectively. Again, native speakers often prefer the shorter version because it's faster, clearer, and feels more natural. Now, let's think about the difference between saying, I have been thinking about visiting a new city next month, and I'm thinking about visiting a new city next month. While both are grammatically correct, the first version sounds a bit more complicated than it needs to. The second version is much more direct, and it sounds much more natural in a casual conversation. Most of the time, when you're speaking to someone in English, it's better to keep your sentences short and to the point, rather than adding extra words to make them sound more complicated. Another example, I really don't understand what you mean by that. This is a sentence that sounds a little stiff. A more natural way to say it would be, I don't get what you mean. The second version is much more relaxed and sounds like something you would hear in everyday speech. Using contractions like don't instead of do not can also make your speech sound more natural. Native speakers often use contractions in informal conversations, so don't be afraid to use them yourself. Similarly, instead of saying, I would like to know if you are available to meet for coffee later, you could say, are you free for coffee later? The second version is more direct and less formal, which makes it sound much more natural in a casual conversation. You're still asking the same question, but in a much more relaxed way that's easier for the listener to understand. Let's look at one more example. I am currently working on a project for my job, and I need to finish it by the end of the week. This sentence is perfectly fine, but it could be made much simpler. I'm working on a project and need to finish it by the end of the week is shorter and more to the point. It conveys the same information, but in a way that sounds more natural and fluid. By cutting out unnecessary words like currently and for my job, you make the sentence easier to follow, and it sounds more like something you would say in casual conversation. These examples show that sometimes less really is more when it comes to speaking naturally in English. When you use simple, clear sentences, you're not just sounding more natural, you're also making it easier for the person you're speaking to understand you. In everyday conversations, people don't have time to process long, complicated sentences. They want to get the message quickly and easily, and simple phrases allow you to do that effectively. Let's talk a little bit about why these simple sentences are more effective. First of all, short sentences are easier to process. The brain can absorb and understand simpler statements more quickly, which means your listener is more likely to stay engaged in the conversation. If you're constantly using long, complicated sentences, your listener may start to lose track of what you're saying or get distracted. But if you stick to simpler language, your message comes across clearly, and your listener is more likely to stay focused on the conversation. Another reason simple sentences work well is that they allow you to speak more fluidly. When you use complex sentence structures, it can be harder to keep your thoughts organized, and you may end up stumbling over your words or hesitating too much. But when you focus on speaking in short, simple sentences, your brain has an easier time keeping up with the conversation, which means you'll be able to speak more smoothly. This will help you sound more confident and fluent, even if your grammar isn't perfect. Of course, I'm not saying that you should always avoid using complex sentences. There are definitely times when more detailed explanations or longer sentences are necessary, but for everyday conversations, the goal should be to keep things simple. Think of it this way. If you want to sound natural, you don't need to show off your grammar skills or use big words. You just need to focus on being clear and direct. By practicing using shorter, simpler sentences, you'll begin to notice that your conversations flow more smoothly. You'll feel more comfortable speaking because you won't be worried about making mistakes with complex sentence structures, and most importantly, you'll be able to communicate more effectively, which is the ultimate goal of learning any language. So, next time you're speaking English, try to keep your sentences simple. Ask yourself, do I really need all these extra words? More often than not, the answer will be no. Stick to clear, straightforward sentences, and you'll find that you sound much more natural and confident in your conversations. It's not about perfection, it's about being clear, direct, and easy to understand. And with time, you'll find that this simple approach to speaking will help you feel more fluent than ever before. In English, contractions are an essential part of everyday speech, and they play a huge role in making your language sound more natural. If you've been studying English for a while, you may have noticed that native speakers use contractions all the time, especially in casual conversations. But why is this so important, and how does it help you sound more natural when speaking English? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. First, let's define what contractions are. Contractions are shortened forms of words or groups of words. Instead of saying two separate words, we combine them into one. For example, I am becomes I'm, do not becomes don't, will not becomes won't, and he is becomes he's. These shortened forms are used constantly in spoken English, and they make speech flow much more smoothly and naturally. When you hear someone speaking English, you'll almost always hear them using contractions, whether it's in a friendly chat with a friend or in a professional meeting. It's just the way we speak. And as a learner of English, using contractions is one of the best ways to sound more like a native speaker. Let's start with one of the most common contractions, I'm. This is the contracted form of I am. Instead of saying I am going to the store, which sounds a bit more formal, you can say I'm going to the store, and this sounds much more natural. In fact, if you said I am going to the store in a casual conversation, it might actually make you sound a bit stiff. By using the contraction I'm, you're making the sentence more fluid, easier to say, and much more natural to listen to. This is how people speak in real-life conversations, and if you want to sound more fluent, this is a great place to start. Another very common contraction is don't, which is short for do not. If you say I don't know, it sounds much more natural than saying I do not know. Both are grammatically correct, but I don't know is something you'll hear all the time in everyday English. Saying do not sounds more formal, and it doesn't flow as easily in conversation. The contraction don't helps the sentence sound more relaxed and less rigid. And it's not just about sounding more natural. It also helps you speak more quickly and with more confidence. When you use contractions like don't, your speech becomes faster and more fluid, which is key to sounding like a native speaker. Let's look at another example. Instead of saying he is going to the park, you can say he's going to the park. The contraction he's is the shortened version of he is, and it makes the sentence sound much more conversational. This is something you'll notice native speakers doing all the time. The sentence he is going to the park may sound fine if you're writing an essay, but in casual speech, it's much more common to use he's. And this is a great rule of thumb. If you want to sound more natural, always ask yourself whether the sentence could be improved with a contraction. Most of the time, the answer will be yes. Let's move on to won't, which is a contraction for will not. If you say I won't go to the party, it sounds much more natural than saying I will not go to the party. Again, both versions are correct, but I won't is what you'll hear in everyday conversations. In fact, native speakers rarely say will not in casual speech. They almost always use the contraction won't because it's quicker, easier, and sounds less stiff. By using contractions like won't, you'll be able to speak more comfortably and at a more natural pace. It's not just I'm, don't, and won't that benefit from contractions. There are many other common contractions that can help you sound more fluent in English. For instance, there is the contraction for they are, he's is the contraction for he is, and she'll is the contraction for she will. These contractions allow your speech to flow more easily and make your sentences feel more conversational. By using contractions like these, you'll sound more relaxed and less formal. But it's important to understand that contractions aren't just for casual speech. They're used everywhere in English, even in professional settings. In fact, if you avoid contractions in your speech, it might sound a little strange. Imagine you're giving a presentation or speaking at a meeting and you say, I do not understand the problem. While this sentence is perfectly fine, it sounds more formal and a bit stiff. But if you say, I don't understand the problem, it sounds much more natural, and it's easier for your audience to follow. Native speakers use contractions in both informal and formal situations, and if you want to sound fluent, you should get comfortable using them in all kinds of conversations. Now, you might be thinking, what if I don't use contractions at all? Well, that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with avoiding contractions, especially if you're still getting the hang of speaking English. However, if your goal is to sound more natural and fluent, you'll want to start incorporating contractions into your speech. By doing so, you'll sound more like a native speaker and make your speech flow more easily. And don't worry if you make mistakes at first. Using contractions can take some practice, but with time, you'll become more comfortable using them in conversation. Let's take a moment to look at how contractions can help you speak more quickly and naturally. In everyday speech, we often don't have time to pronounce every word perfectly. We're more focused on getting our message across quickly and clearly. This is where contractions come in. When you use contractions like don't, won't, I'm, and he's, your speech flows more quickly and naturally. You don't have to pause between each word, and your sentences sound more like something you would hear in casual conversations. This is key to sounding fluent and confident when speaking English. So, how can you start using contractions more effectively? The best way is to practice. Pay attention to how native speakers use contractions in conversations, whether you're listening to podcasts, watching TV shows, or talking to people in English. Try to mimic their speech patterns and use contractions in your own conversations. The more you practice, the more natural using contractions will feel, and the more confident you'll become when speaking English. Remember, contractions are a simple but powerful tool for sounding more natural in English. They make your speech more fluid, conversational, and comfortable. They help you speak more quickly and efficiently, and they allow you to communicate more clearly. So, the next time you're speaking English, try using a few contractions. You'll be surprised at how much more natural and confident you sound. And don't worry if you don't get it perfect at first. Just keep practicing, and you'll get the hang of it in no time. When learning a new language, one of the most important aspects to focus on, especially when trying to sound natural, is the rhythm of the language. Just like music, every language has its own unique rhythm, its own beat, and the way it flows when spoken. In English, this rhythm is crucial for sounding fluent and natural. But what exactly do I mean by the rhythm of language? And how can it help you sound more natural when speaking English? First, let's understand that rhythm in speech is not about speaking quickly or slowly. It's about the way the words and syllables fit together to create a pattern that sounds natural to native speakers. In English, this rhythm is often described as stress-timed. This means that certain syllables or words in a sentence are stressed more heavily, while others are unstressed or weaker. The key to sounding natural in English is learning how to balance these stressed and unstressed parts of the sentence. Let's break it down. In English, content words like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs are usually stressed. These are the words that carry the most important information in a sentence. For example, in the sentence, I'm going to the store to buy some bread, the words going, store, and buy are stressed because they carry the main meaning of the sentence. The other words like I'm, to, and some are unstressed. This creates a natural rhythm where the stressed words stand out, and the unstressed words are quicker and lighter. The rhythm of English isn't about equal timing for every word. It's about giving more time and emphasis to the important words while the other words are said quickly, almost like a filler. If you listen closely to native speakers, you'll notice this rhythm immediately. It's almost like a musical pattern where the stressed words are the beats and the unstressed words fill in the spaces in between. This rhythm is what makes English sound smooth and fluid. It's also what gives it that characteristic flow that many learners find difficult to master. One of the reasons this rhythm is so important is that it helps with understanding and communication. Native speakers rely on this rhythm to quickly process what is being said. When you get used to this rhythm, your brain can more easily pick up the meaning of a sentence, even if you don't understand every single word. The natural stress timing. In English helps people follow conversations effortlessly, and it's an essential skill to develop if you want to sound more fluent. Now let's talk about how to develop this rhythm in your own speech. It all comes down to practice. Just like any other skill, the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. You may have heard the expression, practice makes perfect, and in the case of rhythm, this is absolutely true. When you first start speaking English, it might feel like you're stressing words in the wrong places or speaking too quickly. But with time, your ear will begin to pick up the natural stress patterns in the language, and you'll start to internalize them. A great way to practice rhythm is by listening to native speakers. Whether you're watching TV shows, listening to podcasts, or having conversations with English speakers, pay close attention to how the rhythm works. Try to imitate the stress patterns you hear. Don't focus too much on individual words at first. Instead, focus on how the words fit together in the sentence. Notice how the stress is placed on the key words and how the unstressed words seem to fade into the background. With practice, you'll begin to replicate this rhythm in your own speech. Another useful technique for mastering the rhythm of English is shadowing. Shadowing involves listening to a recording of a native speaker and repeating what they say as closely as possible. Try to match the rhythm, the stress patterns, and even the intonation. This is an excellent way to develop your ear for the natural flow of English. You can start by listening to short sentences or even phrases, then repeat them out loud. As you progress, try to mimic longer passages and entire conversations. The more you practice shadowing, the more you'll internalize the rhythm and sound, more natural in your speech. One thing to keep in mind is that English rhythm is not just about stress. It's also about the speed and the pauses between words. English speakers tend to speak with a certain cadence, where the stressed syllables are pronounced with more emphasis and the unstressed syllables are quicker. But there's also a natural flow where speakers pause slightly between phrases or ideas. This rhythm is crucial for making your speech sound natural and engaging. Let's look at an example. Consider the sentence, "I have to go to the store to buy some milk." If you say each word with equal emphasis, like "I have to go to the store to buy some milk," it will sound unnatural and robotic. But if you say, "I have to go to the store to buy some milk," with the natural stress pattern, it sounds much smoother. The key words have, go, store, and buy are stressed, while the less important words I, to, and some are unstressed. This creates a rhythm that is much easier for the listener to understand and more natural to hear. The same idea applies to questions. For example, do you want to go to the park? In this sentence, the stressed words are want and park. If you say, do you want to go to the park? With equal stress on every word, it will sound unnatural. But if you stress the key words, it will sound like something a native speaker would say. Native speakers rely on these patterns to make their questions clear and easy to understand. Another important aspect of rhythm in English is intonation. Intonation is the rise and fall of your voice as you speak. While rhythm focuses on stress patterns and timing, intonation deals with the melody of speech. Native speakers naturally use intonation to emphasize certain points or show emotion. For example, in a sentence like, "I can't believe it," the tone of your voice rises on believe and falls on it, showing excitement or disbelief. The rhythm and intonation together create the natural flow of English speech, and mastering both is essential for sounding fluent. If you want to improve your rhythm and intonation, one great way is to practice reading aloud. Find a short text or dialogue in English and read it aloud, paying attention to the natural rhythm and stress patterns. As you read, try to mimic the intonation and pauses that you would hear from a native speaker. Over time, your rhythm will become more natural and you'll sound more fluent. Finally, it's important to remember that rhythm is something that takes time to develop. Don't be discouraged if you don't sound perfect right away. It's all about practice and exposure. The more you listen to native speakers, the more you'll get used to the rhythm of English, and the more natural your speech will become. Keep practicing, and soon you'll be able to speak with the natural flow and cadence that makes English sound so smooth and effortless. In short, rhythm is an essential element of speaking English naturally. By understanding the stress-timed nature of the language and practicing the right stress patterns, you'll be able to improve your fluency and sound more like a native speaker. The more you expose yourself to English, the more you'll get a feel for the rhythm, and the more comfortable you'll become with it. So, keep practicing, and let the rhythm of English guide you to sounding more natural in your conversations. Intonation and emphasis are key elements of speaking English naturally, and they play a huge role in how your message is understood. The way you emphasize certain words in a sentence can completely change the meaning of what you're saying. Even small changes in tone or stress can alter the listener's interpretation of your words. So understanding how to use emphasis and intonation is vital for sounding natural in English. Let's start by talking about what happens when you change the emphasis in a sentence. Imagine you're saying the sentence, "I love this song." The meaning of this sentence can change depending on which word you emphasize or stress. If you emphasize love, like this, "I love this song," it suggests that you are really expressing your strong feelings of love for the song. You're focusing on the emotion of love, perhaps because this song is your favorite, or because it brings back strong memories. When you emphasize love, you're putting all your energy into that emotion, telling the listener that this song really means something to you. You could use this intonation in a conversation when you're talking about something that you feel passionate about. Now let's change the emphasis to the word song. If you say, "I love this song," with emphasis on song, you're shifting the focus to the song itself. It suggests that you're highlighting the particular song that you're referring to, possibly in contrast to other songs. Maybe you've been listening to a lot of music and this one stands out. By emphasizing song, you're indicating that the song in particular is the object of your affection, rather than your overall feelings of love. This small change in emphasis shifts the meaning from a general feeling of love to focusing more on the specific item you're talking about. In English, the placement of stress can tell the listener whether you're focusing on the subject, the object, the action, or even the situation itself. This is why intonation and emphasis are so important. They help convey the exact message you want to communicate. It's not enough to just say the words. How you say them makes all the difference. Let's consider another example. Take the sentence, "You did a great job." If you say, "You did a great job," with emphasis on did, you're highlighting the action itself. Perhaps you're surprised that the person was able to accomplish something, and you're focusing on their effort. You're telling them that the action, the doing of the task, is what impressed you. On the other hand, if you say, "You did a great job," with emphasis on great, you're focusing on the quality of their work. You're telling them that not only did they do the task, but they did it excellently. You might use this emphasis when you want to praise someone for the quality of their work or performance, showing that you think they did an outstanding job. This difference in emphasis can also show your attitude or emotional state. If you say, "I can't believe you're late," and you emphasize late, like this, "I can't believe you're late," it shows frustration or surprise. You're pointing out that being late is unexpected or unacceptable. If instead you emphasize believe, like this, "I can't believe you're late," it shows disbelief or astonishment. You're expressing that you're shocked or surprised that this person is late, perhaps because it's out of character for them. The same sentence can convey completely different emotions depending on which word is stressed. Emphasis can also change depending on the context. In a conversation, you might use emphasis to clarify your point or to express doubt or confidence. For instance, if someone says, "I heard you were going to the party," and you want to confirm that you are indeed going, you might say, "Yes, I'm going to the party," putting stress on going to make sure they know you're definitely attending. On the other hand, if you want to express uncertainty about whether you'll attend, you could say, "Yes, I'm going to the party," with emphasis on party, as if to clarify that you're not certain it's happening or that you're not 100% sure about the event itself. Changing the emphasis also plays a role when you're asking questions. The sentence, "Are you coming to the party?" can have a different meaning depending on where the stress is placed. If you emphasize coming, like this, "Are you coming to the party?" it shows that you're focusing on the action of coming, possibly because you want to know if the person plans to attend or not. You could be asking because you need to know whether to expect them. But if you emphasize party, like this, "Are you coming to the party?" you might be wondering if they are attending a particular party that you've been talking about, as opposed to a different event. The emphasis on party changes the focus from the action to the event itself, letting the listener know you're referring to a specific situation. This ability to change meaning with emphasis can be seen in both statements and questions. It's important to remember that, in English, we often use this technique to clarify, to stress an important point, or to express a certain emotion. This is something you should practice in your own speech. Listen to how native speakers emphasize different words in various contexts, and try to imitate their patterns. By doing so, you'll develop a more natural-sounding way of speaking. Let's look at another example using a negative statement. I don't like this movie. If you emphasize like this, I don't like this movie, you're stressing the action of liking. You're telling the listener that it's not about the movie itself, but about your personal feelings toward it. But if you emphasize movie like this, I don't like this movie, it implies that you're not referring to movies in general, but specifically to this particular movie. This type of emphasis helps you to narrow down the meaning and provide more context in your conversation. As you can see, emphasis and intonation are incredibly important in English, not just for understanding what's being said, but also for conveying the right message. Whether you're telling someone how much you love a song or whether you're expressing disbelief that they're late, where you place the emphasis can change everything. In fact, it's one of the key components in sounding natural. If you focus on the rhythm and the way emphasis shifts in sentences, you'll be able to communicate more clearly and more naturally in English. This ability to control emphasis and intonation will also help you sound more like a native speaker. Native speakers don't think about stress patterns. They simply use them instinctively. By practicing emphasis and listening closely to how native speakers shift their intonation, you'll be able to incorporate these natural rhythms into your own speech. The more you practice, the more fluent and natural you'll sound. Keep listening, keep practicing, and soon you'll notice just how much of a difference these small changes in emphasis can make in your ability to communicate effectively in English. Let me introduce you to Daniel, a student from Germany who, like many learners of English, was very focused on using formal language. When Daniel first started speaking English, he thought that using big, formal words would make him sound more intelligent and more fluent. So he began to incorporate a lot of complex vocabulary into his conversations, trying to impress others with his knowledge of the language. But as you might imagine, things didn't always go the way he expected. One of Daniel's biggest struggles was that, while his English was grammatically correct, his conversations didn't feel natural. In fact, when he spoke, he often noticed that his friends would look a bit confused or even uncomfortable. At first, he didn't understand why this was happening. He thought he was speaking perfectly well, but he wasn't getting the same positive reactions that he hoped for. He was using words like individuals instead of people, assist instead of help, and commence instead of start. These words, though technically correct, sounded stiff and overly formal in everyday conversations. And as you can imagine, this caused some distance between him and the people he was speaking with. Daniel started to feel a bit discouraged. He had been working so hard to learn English, and yet he wasn't connecting with people as he hoped. He couldn't figure out what he was doing wrong. That's when he had a conversation with his English teacher, who pointed something important out. Daniel, she said, you don't have to use formal words all the time to sound good in English. In fact, sometimes the most natural way to speak is by using simple and casual language. It was an eye-opening moment for him. He had been so focused on sounding perfect, so focused on using words that sounded smart, that he hadn't realized that everyday conversations in English are often much more relaxed and casual than what he was trying to speak. At first, Daniel was a little hesitant. He thought that if he started using simpler words, people might think he wasn't as skilled in English. But he decided to give it a try. He started replacing some of the more formal words with simpler, more casual expressions. For example, instead of saying, I will assist you with your problem, he started saying, I'll help you with your problem. Instead of saying, I am looking forward to commencing the project, he said, I'm excited to start the project. At first, it felt a little strange for him to speak this way, especially because he had worked so hard to master the formal vocabulary. But over time, he began to see that people were responding differently. Daniel found that by using more casual language, his conversations started to flow more easily. He wasn't getting blank stares or awkward silences anymore. In fact, people seemed to be more comfortable speaking with him. His friends in particular started to open up more during their conversations. The more relaxed everyday language made it easier for him to connect with them, and it also made him sound more like a native speaker. He no longer sounded like someone who was trying too hard. He sounded like someone who was comfortable with the language. This was an important turning point for him. He realized that speaking naturally was more important than using fancy vocabulary. But there's another key point here. It wasn't just about using simple words. It was also about adjusting his tone and approach to be more relaxed. For example, instead of saying, I regret to inform you that we have encountered a problem, Daniel began saying. We have a bit of a problem. The difference in tone was huge. The more formal version sounded stiff and distant, while the casual version sounded approachable and friendly. And that's exactly what Daniel needed to do. He needed to sound approachable, not distant. The change wasn't just about vocabulary. It was about adopting a mindset that encouraged communication over perfection. Daniel learned that speaking naturally isn't about using the most complicated words or impressing people with your vocabulary. It's about making sure your message is understood, making the conversation feel comfortable, and connecting with others in a way that feels genuine. He began to embrace this new way of speaking and was no longer worried about sounding too simple. Instead, he focused on sounding clear and easy to understand. And, as it turned out, that's what really helped him integrate better with native English speakers. As time went on, Daniel began to get more comfortable with this new approach. He found that when he spoke with native speakers, he no longer had to worry about using formal phrases. Instead, he just spoke in a way that felt natural to him. When he was at a cafe with a friend, he would simply say, "I'd like a coffee," instead of, "I would appreciate it if you could kindly provide me with a coffee." He stopped overthinking every word and focused more on how he said things. He learned that sometimes the most natural and effective way to speak English is by keeping it simple. Eventually, Daniel's confidence grew. His new approach to speaking English helped him feel more comfortable in social situations, and it made it easier for him to join in on conversations with native speakers. He stopped worrying about making mistakes, and he realized that the most important thing was that he was getting his point across. His fluency improved not because he knew more complicated words, but because he started embracing a more natural, conversational way of speaking. And this approach helped him connect with people more authentically. Through his journey, Daniel learned an important lesson. Speaking English naturally is not about sounding formal or perfect. It's about feeling comfortable and being yourself. His story is a great reminder that when you're learning a new language, you don't have to overcomplicate things. It's okay to keep things simple. In fact, simplicity is often the key to sounding more natural, confident, and approachable. And as Daniel learned, speaking in a relaxed, easygoing way not only helps you communicate more effectively, but it also makes you feel more connected to others. It's the perfect way to integrate into a community, whether you're speaking English with friends, colleagues, or even strangers. So take a page out of Daniel's book. Focus on sounding natural, not perfect. Use simple words, relax your tone, and remember that the goal is communication, not complexity. You'll find that this approach will make your English sound more fluent, and you'll feel more comfortable speaking in any situation. One of the most effective ways to improve your English and sound more natural is by immersing yourself in the language through listening. Listening plays a crucial role in language acquisition because it helps you internalize the natural rhythms, intonations, and patterns of the language. It's like tuning your ear to the sound of English so that over time you can replicate it when you speak. Let me ask you this. Have you ever listened to someone speak English and it just sounded effortless? Their words flowed so smoothly and their sentences seemed to come together with ease. Chances are this person has spent a lot of time listening to English, whether through podcasts, music, movies, or other forms of media. The more you expose yourself to English, the more you'll start to recognize how native speakers sound, how they use contractions, and how they flow from one sentence to the next without pausing too much or overthinking their words. Listening actively is one of the best ways to train your ear. Simply listening to English in the background is fine, but if you really want to improve, you need to listen with purpose. Active listening means paying attention to the details, the rhythm of speech, the intonation, the contractions, and how native speakers connect their words in a fluid way. This approach will not only help you get used to the sounds of English, but will also teach you how to speak more naturally. One way to practice active listening is by listening to podcasts in English, especially ones that are geared toward language learners. These podcasts often feature conversations between native speakers, and they're a great way to hear the language used in real-life contexts. Pay attention to how the speakers interact with each other, the phrases they use, and the way they emphasize certain words. You'll notice how they use contractions like I'm, don't, and can't, instead of the full forms like I am, do not, or cannot. This is a key element of sounding natural in English because native speakers almost always use contractions in casual conversation. Another great way to practice active listening is by listening to music in English. Songs are a fantastic tool because they often contain repetitive phrases and words, which helps reinforce vocabulary and common expressions. Plus, the rhythm of the music itself can help you get a feel for the natural flow of English. When listening to a song, try to focus on how the singer pronounces certain words and where they place the emphasis. Songs are also an excellent resource for understanding how to combine words in a natural, flowing way. For example, you might hear a singer say, "wanna go," which is a contraction of want to go. In everyday conversation, this is exactly how you might hear someone speak. "Wanna go to the movies?" By listening to music and singing along, you can improve both your listening and speaking skills simultaneously. Movies and TV shows are another powerful tool for improving your listening skills. Watching films in English exposes you to different accents, colloquial phrases, and informal language that you wouldn't necessarily encounter in a textbook. Pay attention to how characters speak to one another in various situations, whether it's a formal business meeting, a casual chat between friends, or a heated argument. Each context will provide a different set of language tools that you can use to sound more natural. And the great thing about watching movies and TV shows is that you can pause, rewind, and replay the scenes, which allows you to focus on specific parts of the dialogue. Notice how often native speakers drop words or use contractions, especially in fast-paced conversations. This is a hallmark of natural speech, and the more you listen for these patterns, the more your own speech will begin to reflect them. Now, let's talk about how to listen actively when you're engaging with these materials. First, make sure you're fully focused on what you're listening to. It's easy to put on a podcast or a song and let it play in the background while you do something else, but that won't help you improve. Instead, sit down, put your phone on silent, and really pay attention to what you're hearing. Try to catch every word, especially the small ones like I'm, your, don't, and can't. These contractions are the key to sounding natural because they're used constantly in everyday conversation. Another technique is to repeat after the speaker. This practice, known as shadowing, can be incredibly beneficial. When you hear a phrase, pause the audio and try to repeat it as closely as possible, mimicking the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation of the speaker. This not only helps you get used to the sounds of English, but it also trains your mouth to produce the sounds more accurately. Over time, this can help you speak with more fluidity and confidence, because you'll be more in tune with the natural rhythm of the language. As you listen, also pay attention to the rhythm of the speech. English is a language with a particular rhythm. It tends to stress certain syllables and words while reducing others. For example, in the sentence, "I can't believe this is happening," the stress usually falls on can't, believe, and happening, while the words this and is are said more quickly and lightly. Getting a feel for this rhythm is essential if you want to sound more natural when you speak. The more you listen to native speakers, the more you'll pick up on these patterns, and the easier it will be for you to replicate them in your own speech. Also, don't be afraid to make mistakes as you listen. It's okay if you don't catch every single word at first. The goal is to get familiar with the flow of the language and improve bit by bit. As you continue listening and practicing, you'll find that your ear becomes more attuned to the sounds of English, and you'll start to pick up more details with each listening session. Listening to podcasts, music, and movies in English is one of the best ways to improve your speaking skills and sound more natural. By focusing on the rhythm, intonation, and contractions in the language, you'll start to internalize the natural flow of English. Remember, active listening is key. It's not just about hearing the words, but about understanding how they're used in real-life conversations. The more you listen, the more natural your speech will become. So, take the time to immerse yourself in English through these listening activities, and you'll see your fluency grow over time. One of the easiest ways to sound more natural when speaking English is by using everyday expressions that native speakers use all the time. These expressions may seem simple, but they are an essential part of daily communication. They make conversations feel more relaxed, fluid, and authentic. If you listen carefully to native speakers, you'll notice that they often use short, casual phrases in their conversations that might not even seem very important on their own, but they actually help the conversation flow more smoothly. Let's start with a very common expression, "What's up?" This is something you'll hear almost every day if you're surrounded by English speakers. In many languages, people might ask, "How are you?" as a standard greeting, but in English, especially among friends or people you're familiar with, "What's up?" is often used instead. It's a casual way to ask how someone is doing or what they've been up to. It's also important to note that "what's up" doesn't always require a detailed answer. A simple, "not much, what about you?" or just, "hey, how's it going?" works perfectly fine in response. It's about checking in with the other person in a relaxed, informal way. Another expression you'll hear a lot is, This one is used to keep the conversation flowing or to check if the other person understands or agrees with what you're saying. It's a very common filler phrase that helps to make the conversation feel more natural. For example, someone might say, "I was really tired yesterday. It's not always necessary to say it, but it's a way of emphasizing a point or making sure the other person is on the same page. This phrase is especially useful because it helps prevent awkward pauses in a conversation. If you're not sure how to respond to a statement, you can simply nod or say, "Yeah, I know," to show you understand, even if the actual meaning isn't complex. Another frequently used expression is, "I mean." This is a way of clarifying something you just said or adding more detail to your statement. For instance, you might say, "I really like that movie. It's just so funny and well made." Here, "I mean" is used to make sure the other person understands exactly what you meant or to expand on your original point. Native speakers often use this to make their speech sound more conversational and less rigid. Without it, the sentence would sound more formal, almost as if you were reading from a script. Adding "I mean" or similar expressions makes you sound more relaxed and approachable. There's also, "You know what I mean?" which serves a similar purpose. It's a question that asks if the listener understands or agrees with you. For example, "I was so stressed out last week, you know what I mean?" If you say this, you're checking in with the other person to make sure they understand the situation you're describing. It's a way to keep the conversation engaging and interactive, showing that you care whether the other person is following along or not. This phrase is often used after you say something that might need further clarification or when you're trying to make a point clearer. Moving on. "Like" is another extremely common word in casual conversation. It's used as a filler word to give yourself a moment to think or to emphasize something. For example, you might hear someone say, "I was really tired yesterday." Here, "like" doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, but it adds a more conversational tone. It can also be used to compare things or give an example. For instance, "She's like the best singer ever" means, "She's one of the best singers ever." It helps soften the statement and makes it sound more personal or informal. "Seriously" is another phrase you'll hear often, and it's used to express disbelief or surprise. For example, if someone tells you an unbelievable story, you might respond by saying, "Seriously?" It's a way of reacting to something that's hard to believe or a little bit shocking. This expression can be used in both positive and negative contexts, depending on the tone and situation. If someone tells you good news, you might say, "Seriously? That's amazing." On the other hand, if they tell you something shocking or unexpected, you might say, "Seriously? I can't believe that." Then there's "actually." This is a very versatile word, often used to correct or clarify something or to add emphasis. For instance, if someone says, "I thought you didn't like that movie," you might respond with, "Actually, I loved it." It's used to show contrast between what was expected or assumed and what the reality is. It can also be used to make a point or change the direction of the conversation. If you want to give more information, you might say, "Actually, I didn't know that was happening." This makes your sentence more conversational and helps keep the dialogue flowing. "Basically" is another common word that helps you simplify or summarize what you just said. You'll often hear native speakers say, "Basically, what I'm trying to say is," or "basically, it's just about." It's a useful word when you want to get straight to the point or explain something in a simpler way. For example, if someone's explaining a situation to you, they might say, "Basically, I just want to help you out," to clarify their intentions. It can make your speech sound more direct and less convoluted, which is important for sounding natural. All of these expressions, "what's up?" "You know," "I mean," "like," "seriously," "actually," and "basically," are used all the time in everyday English. They may seem like small words or phrases, but they actually serve an important purpose in conversation. They make your speech sound more fluid, more natural, and more like a native speaker's. Instead of focusing on speaking in perfect formal sentences, using these expressions allows you to sound more comfortable and relaxed when speaking English. 1. Thing to keep in mind when using these expressions is that context is key. While they help make speech sound more natural, you still need to make sure they fit the conversation. You wouldn't want to overuse them or rely on them too much, as this can make you sound repetitive or less clear. But when used in moderation, these expressions can help you sound more fluent, more engaged, and more like a native speaker. Maria, a student from Brazil, had always struggled with speaking English. She understood everything when she read or heard English, but when it came time to speak, she would freeze up. She knew the grammar rules, could use a wide range of vocabulary, and had even watched many English movies and listened to podcasts. Yet when she tried to speak, something just didn't feel right. She realized that her English sounded forced, stiff, and, most importantly, unnatural. She was stuck in a cycle of trying to be perfect, worrying about grammar and pronunciation every single time she spoke. At first, Maria thought the problem was that her English wasn't good enough, but after listening to native speakers more carefully, she realized that they didn't always speak perfectly either. They made mistakes, skipped words, and used informal expressions all the time. She realized that it wasn't about speaking perfectly, it was about sounding natural. This shift in mindset was the first key step toward improvement. One day, while practicing with a language exchange partner, Maria began to focus on sounding more relaxed rather than worrying about being perfect. She remembered some of the tips she had heard from various resources, like the importance of using contractions and short, simple sentences. So instead of saying, "I do not know how to say this correctly," Maria began saying, "I don't know how to say this." It felt more natural to her. She didn't have to think about every little word or structure, and it made the conversation flow better. Her language exchange partner noticed the difference immediately, and she felt more confident. Maria also realized that she had been making a mistake by overthinking the vocabulary she used. She had always tried to impress others with fancy words, but when she did, it only made her more anxious. Now she focused on using simpler, everyday phrases like, "How's it going?" instead of, "How are you doing today?" This change in approach made her sound much more natural. She wasn't trying to sound formal or complicated anymore. She was just speaking like a person would in a casual conversation. And it felt better. One of the most significant changes Maria made was to stop aiming for perfection. She had spent so much time worrying about grammar mistakes that she'd forgotten the importance of just speaking. After all, language is about communication, not perfection. She understood now that mistakes were part of the learning process, and every mistake was a stepping stone toward becoming more fluent. So, when Maria made a mistake in conversation, she stopped apologizing for it. Instead, she just kept talking. And most of the time, the person she was speaking with didn't even notice. Another tip that helped Maria was focusing on listening more than speaking. She started listening to podcasts, watching movies, and paying close attention to how native speakers used contractions, informal language, and expressions. She even began mimicking their speech patterns, repeating phrases she heard, and paying attention to their rhythm and intonation. This practice helped her become more attuned to the natural flow of English, and over time, her speech began to reflect that rhythm. One evening, Maria decided to test how far she had come. She had a conversation with an English speaker she had met online, and for the first time, she wasn't worried about her grammar or making mistakes. She used contractions, kept her sentences short and simple, and focused on just communicating. To her surprise, the conversation went smoothly. She wasn't nervous or self-conscious. Instead, she was just talking. The other person didn't seem to notice any mistakes, and they even complimented her on how natural her English sounded. Maria felt a huge sense of relief. She had finally reached the point where speaking English didn't feel like a struggle. She realized that the key to sounding natural was not worrying about being perfect, but focusing on communication, practicing regularly, and being confident in what she knew. Her fluency had improved, not because she learned more vocabulary or mastered complex grammar rules, but because she had learned to embrace a more relaxed, confident approach to speaking. She also realized that one of the most powerful tools in language learning is practice. The more you practice, the more you internalize the rhythm of the language, the contractions, the natural expressions, and even the mistakes that will inevitably happen. The more you speak, the more you learn how to express yourself with ease and confidence. Maria's confidence grew with every conversation she had, and as a result, her English became more fluid and natural. A few months after making these changes, Maria reflected on how far she had come. She no longer felt anxious when speaking. Her vocabulary was still growing, But she wasn't obsessed with using difficult words. Instead, she focused on using the right words in the right context. She had let go of the idea of being perfect and embraced the idea of progress. Her fluency was no longer tied to perfection, but to the ability to communicate in a way that felt natural and comfortable. Maria's journey shows us that improving fluency and sounding natural is not about learning more grammar or vocabulary. It's about embracing the natural rhythm of the language, using everyday expressions, not worrying about mistakes, and most importantly, practicing. For Maria, the key was to stop being so critical of herself and to focus on enjoying the process of speaking. She learned that speaking a language is not about perfection, it's about connection. Once she made this shift, everything changed. When it comes to learning and speaking English, one of the biggest challenges that many people face is the pressure to be perfect. There's often this belief that to be fluent, to be good at speaking a language, you need to speak perfectly, with flawless grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary. But let me tell you, the truth is far from that. The goal of learning English is not about speaking perfectly, but about being able to communicate effectively and feel confident while doing it. It's completely normal to make mistakes when learning a new language. In fact, mistakes are a sign of progress. The more mistakes you make, the more you're practicing, the more you're pushing yourself to go outside your comfort zone, and the more you're learning. The mistake many people make is they get too caught up in the idea of perfection, and it actually hinders their progress. The fear of making a mistake can hold them back from speaking at all, and this leads to stagnation. The key is to let go of that fear and focus on communication. Think about the last time you had a conversation with someone in your native language. Did you stop mid-sentence, worrying about the exact word you should use, or did you just say what came to your mind, even if you didn't use the perfect word? Most of the time, when we speak in our own language, we don't think about the grammar or the exact vocabulary we're using. We focus on getting our message across, and that's what matters the most. The same principle applies when speaking English. Let's talk about a personal experience. I remember when I first started speaking English with other people who weren't native speakers. I was so self-conscious, thinking that I had to sound like a native speaker to be taken seriously. I would overthink every sentence, worry about my accent, and constantly correct myself. But I quickly realized that this only made me more anxious and less confident. What helped me was focusing less on being perfect and more on being understood. I noticed that native speakers, even though they were fluent, didn't always use perfect grammar or avoid mistakes. They spoke naturally, and that's what made their speech sound comfortable and approachable. Here's the thing. When we focus too much on speaking perfectly, we become less spontaneous. Our speech becomes rigid, and we start sounding like we're reading from a textbook instead of having a natural conversation. The best way to sound natural is to allow yourself to make mistakes and be okay with it. If you mispronounce a word or use the wrong tense, that's okay. Most people will still understand you because communication is about the message, not the perfection of every word. It's the same way you would talk in your own language. Nobody expects you to speak without mistakes all the time. Let's take an example from a story I've shared before about a student named Daniel from Germany. Daniel had always been very focused on using the correct vocabulary, the most formal words he could find. He thought that speaking in a very formal way would make him sound more intelligent and more fluent. But the truth was, when he spoke with native speakers, they would often look confused or even uncomfortable because his speech was so stiff and formal. He was so focused on being perfect that he wasn't engaging in the natural flow of conversation. Once Daniel realized that he didn't need to sound formal all the time, he started using more everyday expressions and even started using contractions like don't instead of do not or can't instead of cannot. The result? He sounded much more natural and started to feel much more comfortable speaking. Now you may be thinking, but if I make mistakes, won't people judge me? And here's the truth. People don't care as much about your mistakes as you might think. Most people, especially when you're speaking English as a second language, appreciate the effort and the willingness to communicate. In fact, they're likely to focus on the message you're conveying rather than the small errors you might make. Even native speakers make mistakes. The difference is they don't stop mid-sentence to correct themselves. They keep going, and so should you. Remember, making mistakes is a normal part of language learning. I've spoken to many people who, after years of learning English, still make mistakes from time to time. And you know what? That's okay. What's important is that they continue to practice, continue to engage in conversations, and continue to improve over time. Every mistake you make is an opportunity to learn something new. If you don't make mistakes, it means you're not challenging yourself. And if you're not challenging yourself, you're not growing. One of the most freeing things you can do as a language learner is to let go of the fear of being perfect. I promise you, once you do that, your confidence will skyrocket, and your English will improve faster than you think. Don't worry about sounding exactly like a native speaker. Your goal should not be to sound perfect, but to be understood. Focus on getting your message across in a clear, simple, and confident way. When you focus on communication rather than perfection, you'll find that speaking English becomes much easier and more enjoyable. So, let's take a step back and reflect on this. How many times have you been afraid to speak because you were worried about making a mistake? How many times have you held back from engaging in conversation because you wanted to sound perfect? Now imagine if you let go of that fear. Imagine if you spoke confidently, focusing on communicating rather than being flawless. How would that change your experience with English? How would that impact your confidence? I challenge you to start embracing your mistakes and stop worrying about being perfect. You'll be amazed at how much your English will improve when you focus on real communication, not on perfection. So the next time you speak in English, remember that it's not about sounding perfect. It's about making yourself understood. It's about connecting with others. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Embrace them as part of your learning journey. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become, and the more natural your English will sound. Trust me, you've got this. As we reach the final part of our discussion, let's take a moment to review the key tips we've covered so far that will help you sound more natural when speaking English. These tips are not just theoretical, they are practical, simple steps that you can start applying right away. And the best part is, they don't require you to be perfect. Instead, they help you communicate more confidently and effectively, which is exactly the goal when it comes to language learning. So let's dive back into the main points. First of all, one of the most important tips is to focus on using simple sentences. When we try to use complicated structures, we can sometimes lose our message or make it harder for others to understand us. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of impressing others with complex vocabulary or advanced grammar. But remember, communication is about clarity, not complexity. Using short and simple sentences makes your message easier to follow. It helps you sound more fluid and approachable. For example, instead of saying, "How are you doing today?" "I hope everything is going well with you," you can just say, "How are you?" It's more natural, it's easier for the other person to respond, and it's more in line with how native speakers usually communicate. So, when you're speaking, try to keep it simple. Think about how you would speak in your own language. You wouldn't overcomplicate your sentences. The same rule applies when you're speaking English. The second tip that can make a huge difference in how natural you sound is using contractions. Contractions are a key feature of natural everyday English. Native speakers rarely say things like, "I do not know," or "I am going to the store." Instead, they say, "I don't know," and "I'm going to the store." These contractions help you sound less formal and more conversational. Now, I know that sometimes, especially when you're learning English, you might think it's better to avoid contractions in order to sound more correct or polite. But that's a misconception. Using contractions actually makes your speech sound more relaxed and natural, which is what you want when speaking with native speakers. So when you say things like "I can't," "don't," or "won't," you're already taking a big step toward sounding more natural. The third essential tip is to listen actively to English spoken by native speakers. This is one of the most effective ways to internalize the natural rhythm and flow of the language. The more you listen, the more you begin to understand how the language works in real-life conversations. Whether you're listening to podcasts, watching movies, or even just having casual conversations with friends, exposure to spoken English helps you absorb the sounds, the pace, and the nuances of the language. Pay attention to how people use contractions, how they emphasize certain words, and how they change their intonation to convey meaning. Listening actively will train your ear to recognize the patterns of natural speech, and before you know it, you'll start using those patterns yourself. One thing that many learners overlook is the importance of listening to different accents and styles of speaking. English is spoken all over the world, and each region has its own unique way of pronouncing words and using expressions. So, it's important to expose yourself to a variety of accents and contexts. For example, you can listen to podcasts from the UK, watch movies from the US, or even check out content from Australia or South Africa. The more you listen to different accents, the more adaptable you'll become to different ways of speaking, and the easier it will be for you to understand and engage in conversations with people from various parts of the world. This also gives you the flexibility to adjust your own speaking style depending on who you're talking to. Another point to keep in mind when practicing your English is to try to speak as much as possible. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that you need to be in a perfect environment, like an English-speaking country or a formal class, before you can start practicing. But that's not true. You can practice anywhere, anytime. Whether you're at home, in a cafe, or even talking to yourself in front of a mirror, the more you speak, the more natural your speech will become. It doesn't matter if you make mistakes. What matters is that you're using the language regularly. The more you use English, the more comfortable you'll feel with it, and the more natural you'll sound over time. Additionally, don't be afraid to imitate native speakers. If you hear a phrase or expression that sounds particularly natural, try repeating it aloud. You can practice the way they say it, focusing on the rhythm, intonation, and emphasis. You'll find that your pronunciation improves, and you'll start to sound more like a native speaker too. The key here is not to overthink it. Just repeat what you hear and pay attention to how native speakers say things in everyday conversations. You might even want to record yourself speaking and compare it to the original. This will help you identify areas for improvement and track your progress. Finally, don't forget to be patient with yourself. Language learning is a journey, and it takes time. The more you practice, the more confident you will become. And remember, everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. So, don't be discouraged if you don't get it perfect every time. Instead, focus on the progress you're making and the small improvements that add up over time. With each conversation, with each practice session, you're getting one step closer to sounding more natural and more confident in your English. So, as a recap, here are the key tips to keep in mind. Use simple sentences to communicate clearly, embrace contractions to sound more conversational, and listen actively to real-life English to internalize natural speech patterns. Don't forget to practice speaking regularly, imitate native speakers, and be patient with yourself throughout the process. The more you follow these steps, the more natural you'll sound when speaking English, and the more confident you'll feel in your ability to communicate. Keep practicing, keep listening, and keep speaking, and you'll see how much progress you can make. Now that we've discussed all these essential tips on how to sound more natural when speaking English, it's time to put them into action. The next time you speak English, whether you're having a conversation with a friend, participating in an online class, or simply practicing on your own, take a moment to focus on the techniques we've talked about today. Start by keeping your sentences simple. Instead of trying to impress someone with complex vocabulary or long phrases, aim for clarity and ease. If you're talking about your day, just say, "I went to the store," instead of something like, "I went to the store to purchase some items I had been needing for a while." The simpler you keep it, the more natural it will sound. Remember, natural. Conversation is about being understood quickly and easily, not about impressing anyone with complicated speech. Next, try using contractions. Instead of saying, "I am going to," or "I do not know," practice saying, "I'm going to," or "I don't know." This will help you sound more fluent and less formal, just like a native speaker would. In fact, if you listen closely to how native speakers converse, you'll notice they almost always use contractions. It's just the way we speak in everyday situations. Also, don't forget to focus on listening. The more you listen to English being spoken, whether through podcasts, movies, or conversations with others, the more you'll start to pick up on the natural rhythm and flow of the language. This will help you internalize those patterns and naturally start to use them in your own speech. Pay attention to how people emphasize certain words, the tone of their voice, and how their speech flows. These things matter when it comes to sounding more natural. When you're practicing these techniques, remember that it's okay to make mistakes. The goal here is not perfection, but communication. Focus on getting your message across clearly and comfortably. Try not to stress about making every sentence sound perfect. Instead, embrace the idea that mistakes are part of the process, and they're a great way to learn. The more you practice, the more confident you'll feel, and eventually, you'll notice that speaking English naturally becomes easier. Another key point is that you don't need to wait for a perfect moment to practice. You can practice whenever you want and anywhere. While you're walking to work, cooking dinner, or even talking to your pets, practice speaking in English. You can also practice with a language partner or join an online group where you can engage in casual conversations. The more you put yourself in situations where you're speaking English, the more natural you'll sound over time. And lastly, share your progress with the community. One of the best ways to stay motivated is by connecting with others who are on the same journey. You don't have to be perfect to share your experiences. Whether it's a small conversation or a longer exchange, every bit of practice counts. Share your stories with us. Let us know how you've been applying these tips, and tell us how you feel about your progress. It's so encouraging to hear about your experiences and to see how you're all growing in your confidence. I want to challenge you to take one or two of these tips and apply them in your next conversation. Keep things simple, use contractions, listen closely to how others speak, and don't worry about being perfect. Just focus on communicating clearly and confidently. Then, when you're ready, share your experience with the community. Tell us about the challenges you faced and how it felt to speak more naturally. This helps everyone, including yourself, keep improving. We're all here to learn together, so don't hesitate to share your journey. So remember, keep practicing these tips and take that next step in your English learning. The more you apply these simple yet powerful strategies, the more natural you'll sound. And don't forget, the more you practice, the better you'll get. Keep at it, and let us know how it's going. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the English Talk Community. It's been a pleasure sharing these tips and stories with you, and I really hope that you're feeling inspired and ready to put these ideas into practice. Whether you're just starting out with English or you've been learning for a while, the most important thing is that you keep going. Progress takes time, but with each conversation and every practice session, you're getting closer to sounding more natural and confident in your English. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all the latest episodes, and you'll have access to even more tips, stories, and insights that can help you continue improving. We cover a wide range of topics here, so no matter where you are in your learning journey, there's always something new and useful waiting for you. If you've enjoyed this episode, or if you've learned something new today, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to share your experiences with the community, and let us know how you've been practicing these tips in your own life. I'm sure your story will inspire others as well. It's amazing to see how we can all support each other in our English learning journey, no matter where we come from or what level we're at. And as we close, I want to leave you with one last message. Remember, the key to improvement is practice, and most importantly, having fun in the process. Language learning should never feel like a chore. It's an exciting journey, and each step, even the small ones, is an achievement. So, enjoy the ride. Keep practicing, keep exploring, and most of all, enjoy the progress you're making. English isn't just about speaking perfectly. It's about connecting, sharing, and enjoying the process of learning and growing. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope to see you in the next episode, where we'll continue to explore more ways to improve your English and make it a part of your everyday life. Take care, and remember, keep practicing, keep having fun, and I'll see you soon.